That Friday night was the most intense and unforgettable experience of my life. The place was really calm, and it made me feel really peaceful after a tough week. I really needed to rest, and I was lying down when I thought, nothing can mess up this peaceful night. I had been a single mom for 8 years after my divorce. That Friday night was the most intense and unforgettable experience of my life. The place was exceptionally tranquil, and it made me feel really peaceful after a rough week. I was really tired, and I wanted to rest. I thought nothing could mess up the peace of the night. I had been a single mom for 8 years after my divorce. My ex-husband and I were friends, but we had drifted apart. Raising my son, Daniel, alone was the most fulfilling and difficult thing I had ever done. He was my everything, smart, funny, and kind. But it was hard to be both a mom and a dad. I was so tired that I barely had the energy to put on my pajamas before falling into bed. The house was silent. Daniel had gone to bed hours earlier after playing video games and doing his homework. Finally, my husband and I were friends, but we had drifted apart. It was really hard to raise my son Daniel by myself. He was my everything. He was smart, funny, and kind. But it was hard to be a mom and a dad. I was so tired that I didn't even have the energy to put on my pajamas before I fell asleep. The house was silent. Daniel had gone to bed hours earlier after playing video games and doing his homework. Finally, I had a moment to myself in my room. The moon shone through the thin curtains, casting soft shadows on the walls. I snuggled under the blanket, enjoying the warmth and letting my mind wander. Life had been calm lately, which was a nice change after a difficult year. Daniel and I had been through a lot together since his dad left, but we had built a good life together. Even though Daniel was almost 20 now, we were still very close. He was always caring and thoughtful. Sometimes, I worried that he took on too much responsibility. I smiled when I thought about him. He was so kind, and I felt lucky to have him in my life. But tonight, I was too tired to think. I felt heavy and sleepy. Then I heard a soft knock on my bedroom door. I woke up a little, thinking it was part of a dream, but the knock came again, gently. I was fully awake. "Mom," Daniel's voice was quiet, but it was enough to wake me up. I blinked, trying to focus on the door. I could see Daniel's outline in the dim light from the hallway. I sat up, trying to wake myself up completely. "Daniel, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice still sleepy. He hesitated before entering the room and carefully shutting the door behind him, looking like he wasn't sure if he was there. "I couldn't sleep," he said, looking down as he got near my bed. I was worried because it was clear that something was bothering him after the divorce. Daniel sometimes had insomnia, but he hardly talked about it. He knew that his dad's leaving hurt him more than he showed, and this evening, I could see the sadness in his face. "Daniel, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice still sleepy. He hesitated before coming into the room and closing the door. Looking down, he said, "I couldn't sleep." I was worried. He sat down near my bed. I was worried because it was clear that something was bothering him. Daniel sometimes had insomnia, but he didn't talk about it much. He knew his dad's death affected him more than he let on. This evening, I could see the sadness in his eyes. "Come here," I said gently, pointing to the empty spot next to me on the bed. "You can stay with me tonight if you want." He paused for a moment before coming over and lying down next to me. He was on his side, facing me in the dim light. He looked tired, and he seemed really vulnerable. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked gently. Daniel shook his head. His dark hair was covering his eyes. "No, I just want to be near you," I said. My heart felt warm. It had been a long time since Daniel wanted to be that close to me. I remembered his youth, so I touched his hair and smiled. "It's all right," I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. "You can stay as long as you need." He smiled, but I could tell he was worried about something. I remember when he was a kid, and I put my hand on his shoulder and said, "Hey, you can stay as long as you need." He smiled, but I could tell he was nervous about something. I didn't want to push him, so I just relaxed and pulled the blanket over us. We lay there for a while, just enjoying the quiet. I thought Daniel was asleep, but his breathing got really slow. I didn't want to talk about it, so I didn't. Instead, I leaned back and pulled the blanket over us. We lay there for a while, enjoying the quiet. Then Daniel started breathing slowly, like he was falling asleep. But then he said something that surprised me. He asked, "Mom, do you ever miss him?" I was surprised by the question, but I knew he was talking about his dad. It was something I hadn't asked him in a long time. I wasn't sure how to answer. I told him that sometimes I miss him, but our relationship was difficult. Daniel, as you know, nodded. But I could tell he wanted more. He asked, "Do you ever think about how things could have been different?" I sighed. I thought about past regrets, but we can't change the past. We have to move forward. Progress. Daniel looked down and played with the blanket. I guess I just wonder if I could have done things differently, if I'd been better. His words hit me hard. I got up and faced him. "No, this isn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong," I said. "Daniel," I thought to myself, looking down at the blanket. "I wonder if I could have done things differently if I'd been better." His words hit me hard. I got up and faced him. "No, this isn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong," I said, earnestly. He averted his gaze, and his voice was barely audible sometimes. "It feels like if I'd been better, maybe Dad wouldn't have left," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes as I embraced him. He hesitated for a moment, but then he embraced me, burying his face in my shoulder. "Daniel, listen to me," I said, my voice trembling. "Your father made his own choices. That's not your responsibility. You've always been more than enough for me, Daniel," I whispered, my voice filled with love and reassurance. "You're everything to me." He nodded against my shoulder, but I could still sense the tension within him. The weight of years of unspoken pain and guilt. We held each other closely. The silence between us was comforting. His body gradually relaxed, his breathing slowed. He was deep in sleep, but as he slumbered peacefully beside me, my mind was filled with thoughts and memories. We had both been through a lot, and yet, with the quiet comfort of that shared embrace, an unexpected feeling stirred within me. It was a warmth that spread through my chest, a connection that felt deeper and more intimate than the usual bond between a mother and her son. He tried to dismiss it to focus on the rhythm of his breathing, but the feeling persisted. There was a quiet voice that wouldn't go away. Morning came too early. The soft light of dawn painted the room with gentle colors. Hughes Daniel slept soundly beside me. His face was peaceful and relaxed. The tension from the previous night seemed to be gone. I watched him for a moment. My heart swelled with love and pride. But I also felt a strange feeling. It was like an undercurrent beneath the surface of my maternal affection. I slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb him, and made my way downstairs to prepare breakfast. The familiar rhyme of the familiar sounds of cooking offered a sense of normalcy, but my thoughts kept returning to our late-night conversation. Daniel had always been sensitive, but I hadn't realized the extent to which he had internalized his father's absence. The guilt he carried weighed heavily on my heart, a burden I wish I could alleviate. But it wasn't just that the Asian that lingered in my mind was the way he had looked at me. It was also the vulnerability in his eyes, and the unspoken longing for something more. And if I was honest with myself, the warmth I had felt while holding him had. Something stirred deep down, a connection that went beyond our family roles. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that he was my son, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like a quiet but obvious reminder that we had a connection. Soon, Daniel woke up from his sleep. His hair was a mess, and he was still tall and skinny, but he also looked more mature. His eyes showed he was growing up, and you could tell he was becoming the man he was going to be. I greeted him with a warm smile, trying to hide the emotions I was feeling. "Hey, good morning, sleepyhead," I said, putting a plate of pancakes in front of him. He mumbled as he sat down and started eating. We ate in silence. The morning light was warm in the kitchen. I felt like he was looking at me sometimes, but I didn't say anything about what had happened the night before. He seemed more relaxed, like himself, and I didn't want to ruin that. Then Daniel said something. His voice was full of, "Thanks for last night, Mom." His vulnerability surprised me. "No need for gratitude, Daniel. I'll always support you, no matter what." He nodded, but his gaze remained locked on me. There was a question there, but he didn't say it. I wasn't sure how to reply or how to deal with our relationship changing in such a complex way. His eyes showed a new intensity, like he wanted more than the typical relationship between a mom and son. I saw a part of myself that I had hidden for a long time. Breakfast was a weird moment. He was at the counter, tracing patterns on the surface. He asked, "Do you ever think things could have been different?" His voice was soft, but he was clearly holding back a lot of feelings. I sighed, feeling all the regret from the past weighing me down. I answered, "I guess not. We can't change what happened. We just got to move forward." He nodded, but he still looked upset. "I wonder if I could have done something better," he said quietly, sounding guilty and confused. His words hit me hard, and I reached out to him. I put my hand on his shoulder and pulled him close. "Daniel, you didn't do anything wrong. None of this was your fault," I soothed him. My voice was full of passion. He averted his gaze, and at times, his speech was barely audible. I felt really bad for him, and I put my hand on his shoulder and embraced him. I told him he didn't do anything wrong and that none of this was his fault. I soothed him, and I could tell he was upset. He didn't look at me, and he was kinda mumbling. "I think if I'd been better, maybe Dad wouldn't have left." I started to cry, and I embraced him. Residential resisted for a second, but then he gave in and buried his face in my shoulder. I said, "Daniel, listen to me. Your dad's choices." I felt tears well up as I held him, trying to tell him that his leaving had nothing to do with you. He nodded, relaxing, and I felt that familiar warmth rise again, a mix of relief, affection, and connection. The bond between us was defined by our roles as mother and son, and now it was changing. It's shifting, evolving into something new, something we don't fully understand, but we just feel it. For now, I'm holding him close, letting the moment happen without questions or explanations. I'm not sure where this new intimacy will lead us, but I know life is changing, and this is just the beginning. As I lay there in the darkness, it felt like our relationship was changing, even though I wasn't sure how. I was holding my son close and feeling pretty amazed and a little nervous about what might be happening. I felt a warm sense of familiarity wash over me as I realized that my son's embrace was changing, our relationship was shifting, and I felt a bit nervous and uncertain about what was going to happen. But I also felt excited about the new journey ahead. As the sun came up, I felt its soft light through the curtains. Daniel was sleeping peacefully next to me, looking relaxed and happy. I watched him for a moment, and I felt a warm, familiar love for him, but also a sense of uncertainty. Dawn arrived with a gentle push of sunlight through the curtains, waking me up. Daniel slept peacefully beside me, his face looking relaxed and calm. The bird troubles from the night before seemed far away. I watched him for a moment, feeling a mix of familiar love and other emotions. I felt something else, a different current, stirring. It was the same unfamiliar feeling that had danced at the edges of my awareness the night before. It was a sensation that both intrigued and unsettled me. I slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb his slumber, and made my way downstairs to the familiar routine of breakfast preparation. As I stood at the stove flipping pancakes with practiced ease, my thoughts drifted back to our late-night conversation. Daniel had always been a sensitive soul, but I hadn't grasped the depth of his internal struggle. I hadn't realized how he had carried the weight of his father's absence, the guilt he harbored, and a secret he had kept hidden for far too long. Now, all of that weighed heavily on my heart, but there was more. I was flipping pancakes, and I thought about our late-night conversation. Daniel has always been sensitive, but I didn't realize how deep his internal struggle was. He carried the weight of his father's absence, and he felt guilty. He kept a secret for a long time, but now I know more. I also noticed a change in his behavior. He sought comfort in my arms. He wanted more than the typical mother-son relationship. If I'm honest, I felt the same. I felt a warmth when I held him. It was more than just maternal instinct. I pushed that thought aside and focused on the pancakes. His attitude changed, and he looked for comfort in my arms. There was a longing for closeness that went beyond the usual boundaries of mother and son. If I'm being honest, I felt it too. I felt a warmth spread through me when I held him. It was a comfort that went beyond maternal instinct. I pushed that thought aside and focused on the task at hand. He's just a boy, I reminded myself. He's your son, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Daniel finally woke up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. His hair was a mess, a picture of youthful innocence. But there was a new maturity in his gaze. He looked like the man he was becoming. I greeted him with a warm smile, trying to "He's just a boy." I reminded myself that he's your son, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Daniel finally woke up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. His hair was a mess, but he looked youthful and innocent. He looked like a new man, like he was becoming a man. He greeted him with a warm smile, trying to hide the emotions from the night before. I chirped, putting a plate of golden pankies in front of him. He mumbled as he sat down and ate his breakfast. We ate in silence. The morning sunlight bathed the kitchen in a warm glow. I could feel his eyes on me sometimes, but I remained silent, ready to explore. I put a plate of golden pankies in front of him in the morning. He mumbled as he sat down in his chair and started eating. We ate in silence. The morning sunlight was warm in the kitchen. I could feel him looking at me sometimes, but I didn't say anything. I was ready to talk about the things that had happened the night before. He looked more relaxed, like himself. I didn't want to bother him. He spoke up and said he was grateful for last night. I was surprised. I told him I didn't need to say thanks, Daniel. The atmosphere was different after what had happened the night before. Daniel was more relaxed, acting like himself. I didn't want to ruin the peace we had finally found. But then he said something that surprised me. He was thankful for last night. I was shocked by how open he was being. "There's no need to thank me, Daniel," I said. "I'll always be there for you, no matter what." He nodded, but his eyes had a silent question in them. He was showing the feelings I had been dealing with. His eyes had a depth and intensity that went beyond the usual comfort of our bond. The day went on, and Daniel went back to his room to study and play video games. I did my chores, but the vibe between us had changed. It was a subtle shift, like there was this quiet tension and we were both aware of it. I thought about Daniel and how he'd changed from a boy to a man and how close we'd been the night before. I was doing some chores when I noticed the atmosphere between us had changed. It was a little bit of a tense silence, like we were both aware of the connection between us. I started thinking about Daniel and how he had changed from being a boy to a young man, and about how close we had been the night before. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I was also starting to feel things for him in a way that went beyond just being his mom. That night after dinner, we watched a movie on the couch. The room was pretty dark, and the screen was showing some blurry images that were making shadows on the walls. We didn't say much, but we were both glad to be together. As the movie went on, I started to feel things more and more intensely. I thought about it some more, and I realized that my feelings for him had changed. They were more than just the usual maternal love. That evening, after dinner, we plopped down on the couch to watch a movie. The room was pretty dark, and the screen was showing some flickering images that were making shadows on the walls. We didn't say much, just enjoying each other's company, but as the movie went on, I started to notice how close he was. His arm was touching mine, and I could feel my heart beating faster. I tried to focus on the movie, but I could feel the tension between us. It was like a silent symphony of unspoken emotions. Then, halfway through the movie, Daniel moved closer, his arm on mine. This time, he didn't move away, and the warmth of his skin against mine made me shiver. I felt his arm on mine when we were close. My heart was beating faster, and I tried to focus on the movie, but I could feel the tension between us. Then, halfway through, Daniel moved closer and touched me. This time, he didn't move away, and I could feel the warmth of his skin. I looked at him, and our eyes met. His eyes had a new intensity. I had been feeling a lot of emotions I didn't even know I was feeling, and I realized it. I reached out and touched his hand, and he didn't pull away. He gently squeezed my hand, and his thumb traced a circle on my skin. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a lot. I looked at him, and we locked eyes. He was thinking about the feelings I'd been holding in for most of the day. I reached out and took his hand, and he didn't pull away. He gently squeezed my hand, and his thumb made a circle on my skin. This simple act made my heart flutter with a mix of familiarity and excitement. We stayed like that for a while, hand in hand, in the dim light. It was a quiet way of showing how our relationship was changing, and it was a big moment. We had this unspoken understanding, even though we weren't sure what the future held. I knew that act made my heart flutter with a mix of familiarity and excitement. We stayed like that for a while, holding each other in the dim light. It was a quiet way of showing how our relationship was changing, and it felt like we had this unspoken understanding. I knew that even though the future was up in the air, our relationship was changing. Dan was more than just my son. I loved him in a way that was hard to describe. The movie ended, but we stayed on the couch. We didn't even notice the credits rolling. I put my head on his shoulder and listened to his steady breathing. This small thing felt super intimate, like we were acknowledging the new connection between us. Our relationship was changing. Dan was no longer just my son, but someone I really liked in a way that was hard to explain. The movie ended, but we stayed on the couch. The credits were rolling, but I didn't notice. I rested my head on his shoulder and listened to his breathing. This small thing felt really close, like we were connecting for the first time. "Mom, Daniel," he whispered. "Yeah, I'm really glad you're here." His simple words felt like they meant a lot. I was glad he was there, too. I was glad for this new closeness, for this new connection that was scary and exciting. I was lying there in the dark, feeling the warmth of my son's embrace, and feeling a lot in the dark. I felt a mix of emotions. I was glad he was here, and also nervous about how this new closeness might change things between us. I felt a sense of uncertainty, but I was also excited to see where this was going. I had this realization that our relationship was changing. I felt uneasy, but also excited about what was going to happen. It was like we were starting a journey into the unknown. Sunlight came in through the curtains, waking me up. Daniel was sleeping peacefully next to me. His face looked relaxed, like he hadn't had a bad night. I looked at him for a second, and I felt love for him, like I was his mom. But I also felt other things. Dawn arrived with a soft knock on the door. The sunlight was coming through the curtains, and I woke up. Daniel was sleeping peacefully. His face looked relaxed. I watched him for a moment, and I felt a familiar love for him, but also something else. I couldn't define it, but it was the same feeling that I had had the night before. It was interesting and a little scary. I got out of bed, being careful not to wake him, and I went downstairs to make breakfast, flipping pancakes at the stove. As I stood there, my thoughts drifted back to our late-night conversation. Daniel had always been sensitive, but I hadn't realized how deep his internal struggle was. I went downstairs to make breakfast, flipping pancakes like I always do. I thought about our late-night conversation. Daniel's always been sensitive, but I didn't realize how much he was dealing with his dad not being around, the guilt he felt, and a secret he'd kept for way too long. But there's more to it. He's acting different, and he's been looking for comfort in my arms. He wants more than the typical closeness. The weight of his father's absence, the guilt he carried, and a secret he'd kept hidden for way too long were all pushing down on my heart. But there was more to it than that. His behavior had changed, and he'd been looking for comfort in my arms. He wanted something that went beyond the typical mother-son boundaries. If I'm being honest, I'd felt it too. I had this feeling when I held him. It was more than just maternal instinct. Instinctively, I pushed the thought aside and focused on the task at hand. CH was just a boy. I reminded myself that he was your son, but I still had this feeling. I was thinking about the boundaries between mother and son, and if I'm being honest, I had felt it too. I had this feeling when I was holding him, like a comfort that was more than just being a mom. Instinctively, I ignored the thought and focused on the task at hand. CH was just a boy. I reminded myself that he was your son, but I couldn't shake this feeling. Daniel finally woke up, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. His hair was all messed up, looking like a kid, but there was a new maturity in his gaze. I saw the man he was becoming. I greeted him with a warm smile, trying to hide. I greeted him with a warm smile, trying to hide the lingering emotions from the previous night. "Good morning, sleepyhead," I said, putting a plate of golden pancakes in front of him. He mumbled as he sat down and started eating his breakfast. We ate in comfortable silence as the morning sunlight lit up the kitchen. I felt him look at me a few times, but I didn't say anything. I was ready to talk about what had happened the night before. He seemed more relaxed and real. I didn't want to ruin the peace we had, but eventually, he said something. His voice was full of thanks. I felt his gaze on me a few times, but I didn't say anything. I was ready to talk about what had happened the night before. He seemed more relaxed and real. I didn't want to ruin the peace we had, but eventually, he said something. His voice was full of thanks. "Thank you for last night, Mom. I needed that." I told him not to thank me, but he kept looking at me. I said, "Daniel, I'll always be there for you, no matter what." He nodded, but he kept looking at me. I could tell he was thinking about something, and I knew it had to do with the things I had been dealing with. "Thank you for last night, Mom. I needed that." His openness took me by surprise. "There's no need for you to express gratitude, Daniel." I reassured him that I'll always be there for him, no matter what. He nodded, but his gaze lingered. A silent question hung in the air, reflecting the unspoken emotions I had been grappling with. His eyes held a depth and intensity that went beyond the familiar comfort of our son bond. Today unfolding uneventfully. Daniel retreated to his room, immersed in homework and video games, while I took care of household chores. Yet, the atmosphere between us had subtly shifted. It was an intangible change. Daniel and I were connected in a new way that was hard to put your finger on. It was subtle, but it was there. It was like there was quiet tension in the air. It was like we were closer than we were before. I thought about Daniel a lot, and about how he had changed from a boy to a young man. I also thought about how close we had been the night before. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had feelings for him that went beyond what a mom feels. That evening after dinner, we watched a movie on the couch. The room was dim, and the screen was showing dark images that were moving on the walls. We didn't say much, but we were happy to be together. As the movie went on, we started to. I could feel him right next to me, and every time his arm touched mine, my heart pounded. I tried to pay attention to the movie, but it was hard. I could feel the tension between us. During the movie, Daniel moved closer, and his arm touched mine. But this time, he didn't. I could feel him right there with me, and it was kind of scary. But then he moved closer, and I could feel the heat from his body. He looked over at me, and our eyes met. He was looking at me like he was trying to say something, and I felt like I knew what he was thinking. So I reached out and took his hand. I felt a shiver run down my spine when I felt his warm skin against mine. G looked over at me, and our eyes met. His gaze had a new intensity that matched the emotions I'd been trying to hide all day. Without thinking, I reached out and touched his hand. He didn't push away. Instead, he gently squeezed my hand and ran his thumb over my skin. This simple gesture made my heart flutter. I felt a mix of familiarity and excitement. We stayed like that for a while, our hands clasped in the dim light, showing that we were together. We stayed like that for a while, our hands clasped in the dim light, and it was pretty obvious that something was going on. It was a pretty big moment, like we were understanding each other on a deeper level, even though we weren't saying anything. I wasn't sure about the future, but I could tell things were changing. Daniel had become more than just my son. I really liked him in a way I couldn't explain. It was a big moment in our relationship. We were both pretty clueless about the future, but we knew things were changing. Daniel went from being just my son to someone I really liked in a way I can't explain. When the movie ended and the credits started rolling, we stayed on the couch and didn't really notice anything around us. I put my head on his shoulder and listened to his breathing. It felt like a really intimate thing to do, like we were acknowledging the connection between us. "Mom," Daniel whispered. As the movie ended and the credits started rolling, we stayed on the couch, not noticed. I rested my head against her shoulder, listening to the steady breathing. This little thing felt super intimate, like we were officially connected. "Mom," Daniel whispered. His voice was barely there, Yeah, I'm really glad you're here. Those simple words really hit home for me. He was happy to be there, enjoying the unexpected closeness and new intimacy. It was a bit scary and exciting for the first time, like nothing we had ever experienced. His voice was barely audible, but his words, simple, touched me deeply. I was glad he was there. He was pleased to be present, and I could feel the closeness and newfound intimacy, which was both daunting and exhilarating. I felt genuinely alive. There was no confusion or guilt, I just felt the undeniable truth of our love. This love was forged from years of shared experiences, trust, and understanding that went beyond blood ties. It was as natural as breathing and as inevitable as the sunrise. We lay together after hour. I felt so alive there, with no confusion or guilt, just the undeniable truth of our love. This love was forged from years of shared experiences, trust, and understanding that went beyond family. It was as natural as breathing and as inevitable as the sunrise. We lay together after our shared passion, the silence only interrupted by the gentle rhythm of our breaths. Daniel eventually withdrew, I searching mine with a warmth that melted my heart. "Are we okay?" he asked, his voice a gentle caress in the darkness. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. My heart overflowed with emotions that defied. We shared a passion, and the silence was broken only by the quiet sound of our breaths. Daniel eventually pulled away, but his eyes met mine, and his warmth melted my heart. "Are we okay?" he asked, his voice like a gentle caress in the darkness. I nodded, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. My heart was full of emotions that defied words. "Yeah, we're okay," I whispered, my voice filled with unspoken truths. Later that night, after we cleared away the remnants of dinner and the house settled into peaceful quietude, Daniel and I found ourselves on the back porch, enveloped by the tranquility of the night. The air was crisp and cool, and the stars twinkled. I said a few things quietly, and they felt like they were right on the money. Later on, after we ate and the house was all chill, Daniel and I ended up on the porch. It was a nice night, and the stars were looking good. For a while, I felt a lot better. We didn't say much, but we didn't need to. Just being with him and enjoying the night was enough. There was no rush or anything. It felt great to finally feel at ease. We didn't talk much, but we didn't need words. Just being with him and enjoying the quiet beauty of the night was enough. There was no pressure, no hurry. Whatever was happening between us was happening naturally, and I was happy to let it happen at its own pace. He reached for my hand, and his touch made me feel warm all over. I smiled, squeezing his hand gently, and we sat there holding each other's fingers. We were just chilling, but there was something about the way we looked at each other. It was like we were on the same page, and our connection was getting stronger every day. We were at that point where we didn't need to talk about it, because the way we looked at each other said it all. Our connection was getting stronger and stronger. It was more than just a friendship, it was a deep intimacy that was becoming a part of our everyday lives. We didn't need to label it or define it, it just was. It was clear when our eyes met, when we touched each other, and when we shared quiet moments. Every day, our connection was getting stronger. We were getting along better and better, and we didn't fight. I didn't feel like there was any conflict. I felt like it was right to be with Daniel. He was more than just my son, he was my partner, my boyfriend, and we were getting along really well. We weren't even aware of it before, but one rainy afternoon in late fall, we had this huge realization about how much we love each other. It was raining, and the sky was all grey, and the rain was drumming on the windows. Daniel and I were on the couch in the living room, and there was a fire going. We hadn't realized it before, but on that rainy afternoon in late fall, we suddenly understood how much we loved each other. The sky was all grey, and the rain was drumming on the windows. Daniel and I were on the couch in the living room, and there was a fire going. The fire was making the room feel warm and cozy. We were wrapped up in a blanket. The warmth of the fire and the closeness we felt made us feel like we were in a little bubble, away from the storm outside. Daniel was leaning against me, his head on my shoulder. I was absently running my fingers through his hair, enjoying the quiet and closeness. The room felt warm and cozy, with the fire's glow and the closeness of our bodies creating a nice escape from the storm outside. Daniel was leaning against me, his head resting on my shoulder, and I was absently running my fingers through his hair, enjoying the quiet intimacy of the moment. The rain outside made it hard to see, and it felt like we were in our own little world. I could feel his breathing slowing down, and I knew without saying anything that he felt the same way about our connection. He lifted. The rain made everything outside seem blurry, like we were in our own little world. I could feel his breathing getting slower and steadier, and I knew he felt the same way about our connection. He lifted his head and looked at me, and in that moment, we felt the truth of our love. It wasn't just love, it was a bond that went beyond the traditional roles we had played. It was a connection that had evolved into something deeper, something undeniable. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I remained. His head and eyes met mine, and in that moment, the truth of our love was clear to both of us. It wasn't just love, it was a bond that went beyond the roles we had played. It was a connection that had evolved into something deeper, something undeniable. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I remained silent, waiting for him to continue, knowing that whatever he was about to say would change everything. "I love you," he confessed. His hand reached out to take mine, "not just because you're my mom, but because of who you are. Everything about you. I don't know if that's okay or if it's wrong, but I can't help it." I waited in silence for him to say more, knowing that whatever he was about to say would change everything. "I love you," he confessed, his hand reaching out to take mine. "Not just because you're my mom, but because of who you are. Everything about you. I don't know if that's okay or if it's wrong, but I can't help it." His words washed over me like a warm wave, filling the room with a love that made my heart ache in the most beautiful way. I had sensed his feelings, but hearing him voice them and acknowledge the depth of his emotions made it all the more real. I squeezed his hand, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my. His words hit me like a warm wave, filling the room with love that made my heart ache. I felt his feelings, but hearing him say how he felt made it all the more real. I squeezed his hand, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat under my fingertips. "Daniel, I love you too," I whispered, my voice trembling a little. He nodded, searching my eyes for reassurance and a response to the unspoken question in the air. "I'm not sure what this means." It continued, though. I said, "I feel the same way, and it doesn't seem wrong to me. It feels right." He smiled gently, and my heart felt really excited. "I'm glad you feel that way. I'm not sure how I'd react if you didn't." I reached up, gently touched his cheek, and sensed we were on the same page, and it felt right. A smile spread across his face, and I felt a surge of excitement. "I'm glad you feel that way," he whispered. "I'm not sure how I'd feel if you didn't." I reached up, gently stroking his cheek, and felt the warmth of his skin under my fingertips. "We'll figure this out together." We sat in silence for a moment, looking at each other. The only sounds were the rain and the crackling fire. Words weren't needed because we'd already said everything important. We both knew what we were feeling. His skin felt warm under my fingertips. "We'll figure this out," he said. We sat in silence for a minute, looking at each other. The only sounds were the rain and the fire. We didn't need to talk. We knew what we felt, and it was real. Daniel leaned in, never leaving my eyes, and kissed me. It was a soft, tender kiss, full of all the love and longing we had held in for so long. There was no urgency or rush. It was just a pure expression of our deep connection. We were both pretty sure about our feelings, and we didn't talk about the future or what might happen. Daniel kissed me, and it was soft and tender. It was full of all the love and longing we had felt for a long time. There was no urgency or rush. It was just a pure expression of our deep connection. When he stopped kissing me, his eyes showed a lot of emotion, and I realized we had crossed a threshold, a point of no return. Instead of feeling afraid, I felt calm and sure that this was our place. He held me closer, and we held each other as the rain continued to fall and the fire burned. His eyes showed a lot of emotion when he looked away, and I realized that we had reached a new level. Instead of feeling afraid, I felt calm and sure that this was the right place for us. He pulled me closer, and we held each other as the rain continued to fall. The fire was warm and bright, and it made us feel good. In that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges we faced, we would deal with them together. The rest of the evening was full of soft touches, quiet talks, and little kisses. We didn't talk about the future or what it would be like to be together. The rain was falling, and we were embracing. I felt like the present moment and our connection were all that mattered. Daniel had matured from a boy into a man, and our relationship had evolved into something unforeseen, something exquisite, something. The rain was soothing, and our closeness made me feel complete. Daniel had grown up fast, and our relationship had changed in ways I hadn't expected. That suited us perfectly. That night, Daniel came to my room, but this time he didn't hesitate. He got into bed with me, holding me close. It wasn't the way a mom and son would hug, but the way lovers do. Our bodies were joined, and I rested my head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. I listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, which made me feel peaceful. I hadn't felt this complete in years. I realized I was missing something, but I wasn't sure what. Whatever it was, I was ready for it. Daniel and I've always had a close bond with Daniel, but now we're something more. We're partners, lovers, two souls united by a love that goes beyond conventional boundaries. As I fall asleep, a smile spreads across my lips. It's all over the place, but I feel exhilarated. I'd always had a close bond with Daniel, but now we were more than friends. We were partners, lovers, two souls united by a love that went beyond the usual. As I fell asleep, a smile spread across my face. It was all a bit chaotic, but I felt exhilarated, too. I never thought I'd find such deep connection and happiness with someone like Daniel. Our relationship had evolved in ways I never thought possible, and I couldn't be more grateful for it. As I drifted off to sleep, I knew that whatever the future held for us, I was ready to face it with him by my side.